One of the most important questions that Christians need to answer is, what role does the Old Testament still play? What function does it have in the Christian life now that we're under the new covenant? That's a really important question and a really complicated one. There's many ways to sort of dial into the answer of that, but one of the first places to start is to ask the question, what do the New Testament authors do when it comes to the Old Testament? How do they see it, use it, in reference to it? And there's several things we observe there. For one, the Old Testament is the paradigm, it's the structure, it's the story in which Jesus is properly placed. Whenever we see the story of Jesus unfolded in New Testament authors, they always unfold it within the context of the story of Israel and the story of the Old Testament. Another way to think of it is the Old Testament is kind of like a book without an ending. It's like a play without a final act. And the New Testament, in one sense, is the writing of that final act. And so when we ask about the relationship between the Old and the New, we certainly want to acknowledge that the New, in one sense, finishes the Old Testament story. When we look, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, beginning his Gospel with a genealogy, we have every reason to think by doing that Matthew sees himself as continuing that story of Israel, placing Jesus in that long line of David's throne and showing how what he did is to fulfill the Old Testament. So if someone asks, is the Old Testament relevant? Well, yes, to understanding who Jesus is and why he came and what he did. But there's also another way we can answer the question, and that is we can ask, well, what parts of the Old Testament are still binding on us today? What parts are we still obligated to follow? That's obviously a very complicated question, but there's certain parts that we can readily acknowledge are abrogated. Certainly we don't offer animal sacrifices anymore. Jesus is our ultimate sacrifice. Likewise, purity laws that talk about being clean and unclean are abrogated because Jesus now has fulfilled those. They pointed towards the need for cleansing, which Jesus has fully provided. And certainly rules about a nation, national Israel, certainly things we would not apply now to the church because we're not a geopolitical nation. But when it comes to the moral law of God, certainly embodied in the Ten Commandments, we want to ask the question, what about those? Do those still apply? And the answer is absolutely yes. We see that in the New Testament because time and time again, the New Testament authors take the Ten Commandments and apply it immediately to the lives of New Covenant believers. So what's the relationship between the New Testament and the Old Testament? Well, we need it. We need it to understand Jesus, and certainly in many ways it still applies to us today.